everybody, I'm Kate Cass, and welcome to our edition of Let's Talk About. Today, let's talk about Sonic the Hedgehog. It's been quite some time since we talked about the Blue Blurriness franchise, but this summer is Sonic the Hedgehog's 30th anniversary, so I wanted to dedicate a few Let's Talk About reviews to him and his friends on such an occasion. And I figured the best place to start was by resolving some unfinished business. Longtime viewers might remember that back in 2017, I took a deep look into my favorite Sonic character, Shadow the Hedgehog, where I covered both Shadow's appearances in the video games as well as the cartoons. You might also remember that there was supposed to be a third installment of that series where I was going to go over Shadow's involvement in the Sonic comics. And then I never did. I can't even really explain what happened there. I just got focused on my favorite TV shows list, and some other stuff happened if memory serves, and then I just never got back to the Shadow video. But here's where that changes. Today, we follow the example of our favorite Edgy Hedgie and officially put the past behind us. Let's go over Shadow's appearances in the Sonic the Hedgehog comic books. Like most Sonic media out there have actually been quite a few Sonic comic books, but I think a good place to start would be the first comic book published, the longest running at the time of this recording, and the one most of you are probably familiar with, Sonic the Hedgehog by Archie Comics, where we run into an interesting dilemma when it comes to bringing Shadow into the story. See, when Shadow got introduced in those early years, it came with his tragic backstory and motivation, and that led to more complex storytelling. Because, well, Sonic's character doesn't really change all that much, and I don't mean from adaptation to adaptation, I mean at all. Sonic has stayed the same cool, confident speedster with a bit of attitude throughout the games or the many TV shows. He never doubts himself for a situation and keeps a positive attitude no matter the odds. There's even this plot point in Sonic Unleashed where Sonic is so pure of heart that he's immune to giving into the darkness that's turning him into a werehog, which is yet another way that Shadow is a dark reflection of Sonic. Where Shadow is always trying to find himself, Sonic is always sure of himself and his place. They are iconic opposites. Light and dark, yin and yang, Batman and Superman.
I'm Batman.
What? Well...
that was obvious.
Treesicle actually did a great video on Sonic and Shadow where he pointed out that the biggest difference between them is that Shadow has experienced tragedy and Sonic has not. And that's technically true, except for in this comic book. The Archie Sonic the Hedgehog comic series starts out in a dystopian society where Robotnik has conquered most of the world. Most of the family and loved ones of our young heroes, including Sonic's, have been enslaved by Dr. Robotnik for years by the time the story begins. And even after they save what family they can and slowly take down Robotnik's empire, there's still a lot of heavy stuff going on in this book. War, betrayal, torture, mind control, and even character deaths. In this book, Sonic is very familiar with tragedy. So when it came time to introduce Shadow in issue 98 to promote Sonic Adventure 2, it seemed like they didn't quite know what to do with him. Hey, remember how Sonic X found a way to fit the story in its own universe while carrying the same level of investment and emotional weight to it? This is nothing like that. This issue is just a way to explain Shadow's origins in the comic universe, and I mean explain. The first story in this issue is nothing but exposition on Eggman's discovery of Shadow stealing a Chaos Emerald and destroying Silver Sonic, and basically just being a watered down version of the City Escape level in SA2. Sonic and Shadow never meet. Heck, Shadow doesn't even have a line. Most of the story is told through narration boxes. The second story in this issue is a bit better, but not by much. It's still a huge exposition dump, but at least it's Professor Gerald himself recounting the events that led to him creating Project Shadow. And it even makes more sense in the comics why the ultimate life form is a hedgehog of all things, since in the comics, hedgehogs and other anthropomorphic animals are the dominant species, while humans, besides Robotnik and his nephew Snively, were believed to be extinct. Until the discovery of an entire human civilization just a few issues before this one, because the adventure games happened happened, and they had to explain why there are more people waltzing around Sonic's world all of a sudden. Beyond that, Shadow's origin is again more or less the same. The only noteworthy difference is that GUN is a lot more forceful when they raid the Ark than implied before, wanting to repurpose Project Shadow for their own means instead of just shutting it down. And to anyone who was disappointed that 4 kids cut the gun being fired at Maria in Sonic X, don't worry. Here you get a full panel of her being brutally shot in the back. The soldier who did it even calls her a stupid girl. Jeez. But again, there's nothing from Shadow himself. Do we still see him? Kind of. Right here and right here. But just like before, he has no lines. Well, that'll be resolved in the next issue, right? Nope. Next issue is back to the main story, and Shadow isn't seen again for another 26 issues. There's a reason I mentioned Sonic's hardships in the comics before. This series really didn't need Shadow to come in with his little angst-written tone shift. There was already plenty of tragedy to go around. Reading this issue, you get the sense that they only included Shadow's story because they were contractually obligated to. This first appearance feels more like those little mini comics Archie would later put in the end of their books to promote the latest game so it wouldn't interfere with the main story. I think because Shadow was supposed to die in SA2, they just did the bare minimum since we were never going to see him again. But since Shadow would become an extremely popular character, he'd end up getting much more screen time. Panel time? Whatever. He crashes back into the comics in issue 124, a book that opens with Shadow finally getting dialogue, expositing the Cliff Notes version of Sonic Adventure 2.
I wanted the world to pay for Maria, but Sonic the Hedgehog made me see the light.
Oh, sweet Mobius, is he gonna get to have a conversation or what? Well, here's where things do get interesting, because this issue came out 6 months before Sonic Heroes did. So yes, this was the first time audiences saw Shadow again after his supposed death. And because of that, the Archie Sonic team did not know Shadow's story in that game. Like, how the hell did he survive? Which, to be fair, is something the games never did a great job at explaining anyway. But all that stuff about Shadow's amnesia and the androids Eggman created, yeah, none of that is in the comics. Instead, Shadow spends a good amount of his time trying to figure out his purpose, why he was created, and what he's meant to do now that he's living a life on Mobius. Which, on the one hand, seems weird, since Shadow supposedly has all of his memories from SA2 intact, so he should know what his life's purpose is. But on the other hand, I can see Shadow having a big case of what now syndrome, since he survived the events of the Ark that he was sure would cost him his life. For a while, his appearances are a bit of a mixed bag. For example, in issue 133, he runs into the Freedom Fighters for the first time in several months while he attempts to kill Eggman.
Your death, Eggman. I'm going to snap you like a twig, then use you for kindling.
Why? Beats me. He just proclaims he's out to kill him, and when he doesn't get to, he never tries again. I guess he just wasn't in the mood anymore. This is the kind of confusion we're dealing with here. However, while Shadow's motives during this stretch of time in the comics are unclear, at least to me, there are 2 recurring elements that stood out to me during all of Shadow's misadventures. He continues to be used as a tool by others without much regard for his own feelings. Eggman is able to recruit him for a while through manipulation. Again, Knuckles' father, Loke, captures Shadow to use his powers for his own mission. A villain by the name of Adam uses Shadow's chaos powers as a magnet to attract chaos emeralds from across the universe. Even the people who saved his life, which was not Eggman this time, but an alien race called the Bem, only saved his life to fight off their enemy forces while they make a run for it. That might be the most dismissive use yet. I found the conflict with Loke in issue 145 the most fascinating. He's perplexed by Shadow's existence as an artificial being, not able to comprehend that Shadow could have feelings if he was not made the way most living things are. This makes something I touched on back in part 2 a bit more blatant. How many people don't see Shadow as a person, but a thing to be controlled or utilized. But Shadow makes it very clear that he has feelings, as this incident with Loke forces him to recall the events on the Ark, having flashbacks to the many times he's been put in containment, and getting stuck in a traumatic flashback when Loke gets near a girl who reminds Shadow of Maria. We'll come back to her. It's a short story, but it's a somewhat bold look into Shadow's trauma. The other important thing about this time in the comics is Shadow's relationship with characters who really shape his his journey for discovery and purpose, Sonic and Hope. With Sonic, it's a lot of the same stuff. They reluctantly team up on multiple occasions where Shadow develops a mild amount of respect for our blue blur and his heroism, even going out of his way to help save his life a couple of times. He never sticks around after this happens, but eventually Sonic does extend a friendly gesture to Shadow, and it leaves an impact. But that doesn't stop them from duking it out from time to time, because it's still Sonic and Shadow. No matter the medium, it's always nice to see a familiar sight. Then there's Hope. The story behind Hope Kintabor could make for a video on its own, but for the sake of this one, all you need to know is that she's in the Robotnik family. So when Shadow sees her for the first time, he's dumbfounded by her similarity to Maria. He even confuses her for Maria once or twice.
That Overlander girl. She somehow reminds me of my lost Maria.
Which seems odd at first, as does when Shadow starts following this random girl around and becomes obsessed with her well-being. But the more I mulled the events over, the more it felt like survivor's guilt to me. This isn't like the games or the anime where Shadow doesn't remember what happened. He's evaded death more than once by this point, so there must be a reason why. It would explain why Shadow is so hell-bent on trying to discover the reason for his creation, why he was made, and what he's meant to do with his life. Shadow's early days in the comics are mostly spent wandering around aimlessly with no real direction, sometimes being guided through his search for answers by instinct, I think.
I know not why I'm drawn to this place, only that I'm connected to it.
Oh my god! That makes no sense!
But at least there's a motive to his actions, and they might be so aimless because nobody around on Mobius today has the answers he's looking for. The only reason Shadow appears to align with Eggman when he does is because he's the only one who managed to give him something resembling answers, acting like he's someone who understands how he feels and offers to give him a purpose. Even though I think Shadow should have known already that they were quote-unquote family, but semantics. But what really motivates him during this stretch in the comics is Hope. She defends him during the incident with Logue, then she begs Shadow to show him mercy when he's ready to kill him, and offers him her friendship. He rejects it in the moment, but it's clear he cares about this kid, becoming desperate to not let the failures of the past repeat themselves. A mission that slowly shapes Shadow's more heroic actions, even when he winds up working for Eggman. Shadow, despite not getting any of the answers he's looking for during this arc, goes through a decent amount of self-discovery, honing his power to new potential and making more righteous choices when it really counts. The problem I found with this arc is that despite Shadow appearing in several stories, most of them don't really revolve around him, no matter what the covers tell you. Even when Shadow appeared to be the main focus, his stories tended to be secondary to bigger plots, alien invasions, expanded world building that had nothing to do with him, an army of Neo-Metal Sonics, etc. There are more important things going on than Shadow's inner turmoil. The only exception during this time is probably issue 145 and brief segments of the Neo-Metal Sonic invasion. That all changed with issue 171, a story that is entirely and indisputably Shadow's. A story which confirms that despite his current allegiance, Shadow doesn't trust Eggman, and goes to Sonic and the gang to decipher the information left behind by Professor Robotnik that he uncovered at Eggman's lair, which they help him do, and Shadow finally gets his answers in quite possibly the sweetest way imaginable. Shadow gets to reunite with Maria. I mean, it's technically a digitized program of her, but she's able to have a conversation with him, and Shadow is able to talk to her and Gerald Robotnik again, who are more than willing to give him the answers he's been looking for. Gerald even calls him son. Aww. This issue really gets you in the feels if you're a Shadow fan. There's not much to say about the answers Shadow gets. It's mostly all the stuff we learned back in his solo game, edited slightly to fit comic continuity. The significance from a character standpoint is Shadow finding that sense of direction. Being able to give his loved ones a proper goodbye is also really touching, especially when he can't bear to look away until the very last second. The story of issue 171, aptly titled I Am, feels more thematically whole than this journey did for Shadow in the games. There wasn't this whole thing about getting his answers only to put it all behind him. Here, Shadow's motivations come from his past, no longer tainted by vengeance, but fueled by the hope and faith the ones who loved him saw in him. Now that he knows what he was truly made for, he wants to be that for everyone on the planet.
I am Shadow the Hedgehog. I am the union of ideals both dark and benign, but ultimately built in the name of love. I am the ultimate life form. I am the protector of Mobius. Run home to your master and tell him, this is who I am.
It's perhaps not as earth-shattering as this point in Shadow's character development is in other mediums, but I do think there's a real emotional strength here. So now that Shadow knows who he is, he sets out to fulfill his purpose on his own. We don't see him again until issue 182, where he drops in to help Sonic and the gang again, now officially an agent with gun. Shame we didn't get to see his actual recruitment in the comics though. It feels like it would have been the perfect place for it, and I still really want to know how that meeting went down. However, there is a brief mention of Shadow's decision to join them, despite his history with the organization, in the Sonic comic encyclopedia. Essentially, they had the tools Shadow needed to fulfill what he wanted to do with his life, and he found a much different agency than the one that committed those atrocities on the Ark. And if realizing that isn't truly putting his past behind him, I don't know what is. But anyway, Shadow jumps in to have an awesome chaos energy fueled fight with a brainwashed Knuckles. Yeah, it's a long story, not gonna go into that here, but I highly recommend the storyline, so track it down and give it a read if you can. When he proceeds to get his quills handed to him, Shadow kinda just stands around for the rest of the story. The only other major thing of note from Shadow's appearance here is that this is the first time in the comics he removes his inhibitor rings and unleashes a massive chaos blast. Major props to Tracy Yardley and the rest of the art team here. This moment looks just as epic as it deserves to. He shows up again when he chaos controls in the middle of another crazy conflict that really has nothing to do with him in issue 195. Sonic kinda sums up his appearance perfectly.
Hi, Shadow?
This was mainly an excuse to gather as many Hedgehog characters as possible to duke it out, and I gotta say, it was pretty cool. It was also Silver's introduction into the comics, fun fact. Shadow doesn't do anything of major note here again, but what is important is how he gets out of this fight. An out that helps Shadow get a bit more attention. Because, if I haven't made it clear by now, Shadow hasn't had much dedication in the comics up to this point. Outside of a couple of more in-depth issues, Shadow's purpose in the story most of the time is to drop in, throw some punches, maybe ask a couple of vague existential questions, and then leave. But all that changed with the debut of Sonic Universe, a spin-off book to the main Archie Sonic series that was designed to expand the universe, broken up into 4-issue story arcs revolving around multiple side characters. And what better character to kick off a new book like this than the second most popular character in the whole canon? They have a pretty creative way of doing this too. During the Hedgehog Havoc story, Shadow gets into a fight with a metal Sonic that can warp between dimensions. This is how Shadow will get into his own little solo series, but first, a quick pit stop over to the Sonic X comic. Yes, there was a Sonic X comic. It was something. Shadow drops in on the final issue before heading off to Sonic Universe, and it's actually really amusing, since for the Sonic X continuity, this is post-Shadow's arc, but pre-Metarex Saga. So everyone knows who Shadow is, but thinks he's dead. It results in a lot of great reactions. There's a really cool detail towards the end where we see how Sonic X Eggman had Shadow kept in suspended animation, rushing off to double check after seeing Archie's Shadow running around. That was pretty neat. Alright, enough of that, on to Sonic Universe. The great thing about Sonic Universe was that while it took place in the same continuity as the main Archie Sonic series, the focus on side characters was kept intact, and it left room to expand and delve more into Sonic's very popular, diverse, and expansive cast without having to worry about interrupting the main storyline. The first arc with Shadow is an excellent showcase of that, getting to explore many areas of how he's evolved the character, the conflicts he faces when Sonic's not around, and just generally how he lives his life now that he has a clear path. Take issue 2, and the story Time and Again, where we see Shadow recruiting Sonic for a midnight mission, cut with flashbacks to the events of Sonic Adventure 2. It's a really cool way to demonstrate how far Shadow has come, where his dedication is redirected from vengeance to the betterment of the world, not working alone, but alongside a team, including his rival. It may be the second issue, but it's a great way to get a feel for what the Sonic Universe book was all about. It's really cool to see how far Sonic and Shadow's relationship has come, including the part where Sonic saves Shadow from falling to his death again.
Yeah, we're not going through that again.
Another interesting part about Shadow Saga is in issues 1 and 3, which highlights Shadow's sympathetic side towards fellow artificial beings, something that the Archie comics have played with from time to time. Early on, he had continuous rivalries with models of Metal Sonic, which at one point has Shadow tossing aside a gun that would take Metal out quickly because fighting on his own is more fun. I don't think it was meant to be a joke about Shadow's solo game, but it's really amusing in hindsight. He also discovers a dormant robot in an abandoned laboratory laboratory named Isaac, who's basically the Chase version of Gamma. Shadow looked after him and tried to help him get answers while Shadow was searching for his own. These are both things that return and get fleshed out in Sonic Universe. In the first issue, he actually tries to reform the Metal Sonic who zapped him across dimensions, not wanting him to be used by Eggman like he was, and giving him the opportunity to do something more fulfilling. Unfortunately, Metal Sonic isn't interested and only sees Shadow as a weapon with a different function. It's a really well-written conflict. He has better luck with the actual Gamma instead of the bootleg he was hanging out with a few years back. Yeah, in the Archie comics, Gamma is still kicking, and GUN wants to recruit him to help in their fight against Eggman, so they send Shadow to go pick him up. It's another instance where Shadow wants to reach out to a living weapon, this time already out on a righteous path, but all alone. Shadow has a nice moment of explaining that solidarity can be draining, and the benefits of being part of a team and having support. It's really the only insight outside of implications for why Shadow joined GUN, and how they help him in his cause to protect Mobius. He might have continued to show Gamma the pros of being part of a team if Omega hadn't charged in making his Archie comic debut. Yeah, it didn't happen until 2009. I was surprised too. Omega is able to separate Shadow and Gamma and blows Gamma to smithereens, but not before Gamma downloads his soul into Omega. I don't really know, it kind of makes sense I suppose. But either way, Omega gets an auto update and becomes a more heroic robot, if still a bit of a pyromaniac. So Shadow winds up recruiting Omega to join Gun in Gamma's place. It's a pretty exciting development, but Shadow still takes the loss of Gamma hard. To him, it's the latest in a series of failures that he's encountered on difficult missions over the last several issues. This reaches its breaking point in the final issue of this arc when he and Rouge fail to get a Chaos Emerald. Shadow starts to mope, and as adorable as some of this artwork is, it was kind of weird to see. Yeah, Shadow questioning himself is nothing new, it was kind of his defining character trait for the first 5 years of his existence, but it's different here. Before, it was Shadow not really knowing who he is or what he's supposed to do. Now, Shadow is on a clear and determined path, but he feels like he's not living up to the standards as the ultimate life form.
I am the ultimate life form. I was built to be perfect. I'm not supposed to fail.
Thankfully, Hope, who now works at GUN with Shadow, I don't know if I've explained that yet, sets him straight. That failure can just mean a better chance of success the next time. And she's right. Just think about it. He failed to convince Metal Sonic to change his ways, but he did with Gamma, even if he couldn't save him. He was fighting for the wrong things back in Sonic Adventure 2, but he did the right thing by the end of that adventure and in the second issue of Sonic Universe. So Shadow prepares to put those experiences to good use with the official assembly of Team Dark. And yes, it is awesome. Watching Team Dark work together to get that Chaos Emerald feels so damn triumphant after everything, and seeing Shadow in such a sure place with a solid support system feels just as good as it did in that epic moment in Sonic 06. That wasn't quite it for Shadow in Sonic Universe. He also appears in the Mobius 30 Years Later arc and the Treasure Team Tango arc. Let's talk about Treasure Team Tango. While the storyline is mostly a MacGuffin melee between several groups in the Sonic cast after a Soul Emerald, there is some interesting character conflict when it comes to Shadow, being torn between his duty to get the Emerald to protect his world and the obligation of helping Blaze, who helped him back in his solo story. He spends most of the story trying to convince himself that sticking to the mission is the right thing to do, but you can see how bad he feels about essentially betraying Blaze and getting in the way of her saving her own world. After some stern talking to from Amy, he decides to do the right thing and let Blaze have the Emerald. Again, this is hardly Shadow's story, but it's a good dilemma for him, and shows how more willing he is to make his own decisions and consider the needs of others these days. Something that contrasts slightly with Mobius 25 and 30 Years Later. See, this was sort of a potential, but not totally canon next generation story. Long story short, Shadow conquered the Eggman Empire and in the process became king, even marrying Princess Sally. Boy, that must have gotten the shippers really riled up. Shadow's reign leads to Mobius becoming more police, because of course it does, until Sonic and the gang manage to overthrow him. This is kind of a divisive portrayal of Shadow. Some find it an intriguing what if, others think it's just turning Shadow into the villain he's not again. I lean more towards the former. This portrayal always came across to me as, what if Shadow's mission to protect the world in Maria's memory became wildly distorted, believing that the only way to protect the world is to enforce his rule on it, and when people saw that as wrong, Shadow would see them as a lost cause. By the time we get to the 30 Years Later arc in Sonic Universe, universe, he considers the Mobians ungrateful for his protection and sics a weird hybrid of Tikal and chaos on the citizens to cleanse the world of those who weren't grateful for his protection. Yeah, it was pretty messed up, but again, I found it to be an interesting what if. Shadow's actions speak volumes about his mindset in this alternate timeline, like how the rest of the world is to worship Maria's memory as he does. The last thing we see of this version of Shadow is when he laments to Maria that he couldn't fulfill her wish because those around him didn't accept his way. This would hardly be the first time he misinterpreted Maria's last wish, and I found the idea of how far he could potentially go while still keeping that promise rather compelling, especially since this is the only storyline to really delve into the idea that Shadow doesn't age. So there's the question of perspective related to his theorized immortality too. It's like if those dark endings in Shadow the Hedgehog were more believable. But while we're on the subject of alternate timelines, here's where things get complicated. And that's saying something. Most of you watching probably know what happened at this point in the Archie Sonic comics. It was the result of a long, convoluted disaster behind the scenes from any recounts I could find. The extremely Cliff Notes version is that due to confusion on the ownership of Sonic characters created specifically for the Archie comics, a copyright lawsuit went through a massive battle in court, resulting in major legal issues for Archie. So after Sonic's second crossover with the Mega Man comics, which Shadow is in by the way, the restoration of both of their worlds resulted in the Super Genesis wave, rebooting the entire Sonic continuity to get rid of any characters or plot points that could cause further legal trouble. Now, I've made it clear in the past that I'm not that well versed in comics, and I especially wasn't when this happened. So this is my first experience with a massive, universe-changing retcon, because there was a Genesis wave before this for Sonic's 20th anniversary, but it lasted for only a few issues and then everything went back to normal. Sadly, that wasn't the case this time. When I figured out what was really happening, I cannot tell you how heartbroken I was to realize that the universe I had been invested in for so long was gone. And the current storyline that had been playing out for 2 years by this point was never going to be properly concluded, especially considering it had some of the most intense and dramatic developments in the comics history.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
But where the subject of this video is concerned, thankfully, Shadow is one of the characters who suffered the least change in this reboot. He's still an agent with gun, but his history is now purely what happened in the games up until Sonic Generations, I think. So over in Sonic Universe, I guess they figured what better character to bring in the post-Super Genesis Wave universe than Shadow again, in the Shadow Fall arc. If you ask me, they really made lemonade out of lemons in Shadow's case, using the rule to now adhere to game continuity to expand on untapped potential in the games, deciding to focus on an important part of Shadow's past, the Black Arms, with the reveal of a small faction of the Black Arms that survived the defeat of Black Doom and the arrival of a new Black Comet. It gives us much more insight into the inner workings of their society that were really only implied in the game they were featured in, with a particular focus on the hive mind. But this storyline is mainly about Shadow's connection to the Black Arms. He faces some discrimination from his fellow GUN members since he's technically one of them. And it's not just the soldiers constantly reminding Shadow about his origins. Facing that part of himself and what it represents is the root of most of Shadow's conflict in this arc. He uses his mild connection to the hive mind to aid in their mission to destroy the comet, but feels hesitation for a moment at the mission to wipe out the last of a species he's technically related to. This struggle manifests in the introduction of another being similar to him, Eclipse the Darkling, a member of the Black Arms who was created as a countermeasure to Shadow, and his fights with Shadow is the first time a foe really feels like he can overwhelm the ultimate life form. He's even able to block Shadow's chaos control.
All performance issues, it's not uncommon.
Eclipse has his own sense of free will, unlike the other members of the Black Arms. As such, he has a less destructive method to try and solve the problem of Shadow fighting against them, by trying to convince Shadow to join their side again. Now, this little pitch of fighting alongside the Black Arms being his true place might have worked back with Black Doom, but as we covered in part 1, at this point, Shadow is much more sure of himself and his real true place. He's strong in his resolve and uses all of his strength and determination to not be manipulated again. And just like back in Sonic 06, it was so satisfying to watch. He knows who he is now, and he's going to fight for that.
I made a promise to protect that world. You and the Black Arms would see it destroyed. My path is clear.
So since straight up trying to convince him doesn't seem to work, Eclipse, with the help of the current leader, Black Death, try more direct methods, placing Shadow completely under Black Death's control. And I gotta admit, brainwashed Shadow is kinda creepy. The scripting and artwork in the issue where this goes down is magnificent, by the way. I love these strong wills fighting against mind control kind of stories, and this is one of the best examples of presenting this plot I've seen. Especially for someone like Shadow, a powerful being who spent so much of his life being confused by what he should do with his power, often being manipulated by the wrong side into doing their bidding with the promise of a clear direction or answers to his constant questions. Now Shadow is so sure of himself and his direction that he has to be forced to stray from that path against his will. It's really intense and engaging. As is the tried and true method for helping someone break mind control, friendship. Despite having orders to neutralize Shadow if he went rogue, Rouge and Omega are hesitant and worry when Shadow takes the risk of tapping into the hive mind. But when faced with their worst fear, Rouge has enough faith in Shadow's strength and will and just general stubbornness to yell at him until he's able to break free. It's one of those rare moments that forces Team Dark to get all sentimental, and if any moment warranted it, it was probably this one. It felt like the story tapped into a bit of Shadow's loneliness. The fact that he's unique makes him isolated. He clearly has biases against him, and even he struggles with trying to understand what his origins mean when facing them again. This arc even touches on Shadow being immortal again. I know this is something we all kind of assume about Shadow anyway, but I like seeing the main series explore the implications. But when Shadow does lose control, the thing that snaps him out of it are the genuine connections he's made on his journey to fulfill his true life's purpose. Any doubts Shadow had are erased with what he's gained by growing and building a life for himself on his terms. But some things about Shadow never change. When he's free from Black Death's control, he bursts into his chamber and freaking annihilates Black Death in retaliation. Then he stays behind to make sure the mission to destroy the Black Comet is completed, which is very much like Shadow, and I love the fact that Rouge calls him out on pulling another self-sacrifice act. It's all a great climax to a great story, even if that wasn't the end of it. The metaphorical shadow of these events haunts Shadow in his future appearances. He becomes obsessed with hunting down Eclipse when he manages to escape the destruction of the Black Comet, discovering he crashed on Angel Island, forcing him and Team Dark to work together with Knuckles. You can probably guess how well that goes. You know, I never would have thought of a rivalry between Shadow and Knuckles, but when it comes to dedication and stubbornness and the desire to punch any problem that stands in their way, it fits pretty well. I'm kind of impressed with how Knuckles holds up in a fight against Shadow, and this story allows Shadow to use the power of the Master Emerald for the first, and as of right now, only time. Now that's cool. Thankfully, while they have their differences, they're a bit more civil with each other when they have to team up again a few stories later. But in between all the brawling in the storyline, whether with allies or enemies, Shadow is dealing with an inner battle. He's taunted by Eclipse in his head, and occasionally has hallucinations that manifest alien threats. Whether this is Eclipse using the last of the hive mind connection he and Shadow have to mess with his brother, a lingering effect of the mind control, or Shadow's own doubts is unclear. What is clear is that it's taking its toll on Shadow, making him more irrational and obsessed to track Eclipse down on his own without taking into account his disadvantages, which he has against Eclipse. Sure, Shadow has rivals and picks fights frequently, but I'd argue this is the first time he's had an enemy who's been able to overpower him in every possible way. I was really invested in the ways they were challenging Shadow during this post-reboot run of Sonic Universe. The inner conflicts were a great way to take advantage of Shadow's past character faults while tailoring it to fit how much he's grown and the position he's in now. Not to mention that as soon as Eclipse showed up, it was clear he was going to become a fan favorite. And then he was. Even with the handicap of having to completely start from scratch, Sonic Universe was taking Shadow in a very interesting direction, and I was completely on board with the story. I couldn't wait to see where the battle between Shadow and Eclipse would go from here.
Oh, come on!
Right. That happened. Yes, in July of 2017, after months without a new issue from any Archie Sonic series, it was announced that the longest-running video game-based comic book was cancelled. Why this happened, we still don't really know. Whatever is out there is mostly speculation. But after 24 years of success, that was the end of this run of comics. So yeah, Shadow's intriguing storyline with Eclipse will likely never be resolved. Hooray. But that's not the end of our discussion on Shadow in comics. Before we head into the most recent stuff, let's go a bit further back and talk about Sonic the comic book series for Sonic the Hedgehog that was published in the UK. It was pretty successful, running for almost 200 issues and having a dedicated fan base that continued the story after it was cancelled. However, the book officially ended in 2002, right after Shadow's introduction. So even taking Sonic the comic online into account, luckily there's not too much to go over with Shadow's involvement in this series. Well, luckily for me anyway, this is a really long video as it is. But it's still worth talking about Shadow's role in Sonic the comic because they changed his backstory. Yeah, I was not expecting that. I thought Shadow's backstory was the one consistent thing about him. When I realized this, I thought it would bother me more since Shadow's story is such an integral part of who he is, but I gotta admit, I found this new take kind of fascinating. I don't want them making a habit out of it, but sometimes it's interesting to see a different take. In this universe, Shadow is the product of an abandoned experiment involving a sentient form of pure chaos energy, uncovered by a group of Echidna and Robotnik, and completed by combining his energy with Sonic's DNA to create his physical form we all know so well. So, in this universe, I guess Shadow actually is a faker. Much like his other counterparts, Shadow complies with the desires of the people who revived him only because they line up with his own mission, revenge. But why does he want revenge if there's no Ark, no Professor Gerald, no Maria? Well, we find out in issue 234 when Shadow takes Sonic back in time, which is a really cool idea. I can only imagine what it would be like for Sonic to see Shadow's original origins this way. But anyway, before the Echidna discovered him, he was found long ago by a lost scientist by the name of Ovi Kintabor. Apparently in this continuity, Robotnik used to be a good scientist, but due to an accident developed a completely evil personality with his entire past forgotten. It's sort of a Simon to Ice King situation, I think. What's important is that Kintabor kept Shadow company and considered him a companion. Even if he couldn't complete the experiment or even communicate with him, Kintabor still talked to him, and Shadow listened and remembered that. Shadow grew attached to Kintabor, and because of that, despises Sonic, blaming him for turning the good doctor into the mad scientist he is today. Which Sonic might have actually been responsible for, I'm not positive. I apologize if I'm confused or butchering this, by the way. I don't know this continuity really well. From what I can gather, we never find out why Shadow was originally created or by whom, but unlike his Archie counterpart, this Shadow doesn't care who made him or why. All that matters to him is getting revenge, wanting to destroy the world in retaliation. So, different circumstances or not, Shadow wants to see the world burn because of the tragic loss of a Robotnik.
Some things never change.
After several confrontations with Sonic where Shadow's motives are unwavered, including one encounter with that evil-looking Super Sonic, which is like the one thing from the series every US fan has at least heard of, Shadow ultimately does what he always does, sacrifices himself to save someone else. In this case, depleting the last of his chaos energy that keeps his body stable to save Robotnik when the egg carrier crashes. I gotta admit, the self-sacrifice route is kind of abrupt for this Shadow. In some respects, it does feel right that it was for Robotnik, as weird as that might sound. Even if there's nothing of Kintabor left in there, he's still the closest thing Shadow ever had to a friend. Conceptually it works, execution is another story. And this is the last way Shadow's story in Sonic the comic deviates from every other version of him, because this death seems to stick. Except that apparently he came back as a robot or something, but I'm not counting that, it's not the same guy. Sonic the comic changed more about Shadow than any other version of him so far, in some ways that are kind of interesting to see new spins on, and others that I don't think were nearly as fleshed out as they could have been. They had some cool ideas on how to reinvent Shadow's story, I just wish they were explored to their full potential. Alright, now let's talk about the current run. Shortly after the Archie Sonic comics were cancelled, it was announced that the Sonic comic torch would be picked up by IDW, who has a pretty great track record of IP comic runs of all kinds, so I was pretty confident in this. This time we're sticking closely to game continuity for our main cast almost immediately after Sonic Forces. The Resistance forces are still functioning and they're on the search for Eggman, who appears to have disappeared.
Everybody got that?
We're about 40 issues in at the time of making this video, and the IDW series has been pretty well received. However, from what I've seen, if there's anything divisive about it, it's Shadow. Now, I was warned about Shadow's betrayal ahead of time, that he was a full-on edgelord now, an angry caricature of what he once was. But now having read his sections for myself, I don't really see what warrants this much outrage. Yeah, he is a bit more condescending and angry these days, but for the most part, I found it to be a valid take on the character. I particularly liked his debut in issue 6, where he and Sonic fight over what to do about an amnesiac Eggman. Sonic wants him to leave him alone since he's not really Eggman anymore, while Shadow charges in wanting to, as Sonic Universe would put it, neutralize him, pointing out that someone losing their memory doesn't make them any less of a threat. And he would know, wouldn't he? That's what's so interesting about this issue. Shadow wants to take down Eggman once and for all because he's a threat to everything he's promised to protect, while Sonic reminds Shadow that he used to be just as bad a threat. That's the price of offering redemption. It could lead to continued threats, but it could also create powerful allies. Sonic's willing to take that chance because he already has before.
After all, if he can't be forgiven, can you?
So, with that perspective in mind, Shadow eventually concedes. Shadow has been a dismissive loner during most of his appearances so far, and I think that's part of what bothers people after the camaraderie that was more common in the Archie run, particularly in Universe. But since IDW is closer connected to the games, let's be real, outside of Team Dark, Shadow's never been much of a team player unless he had to be. And even with Team Dark, it could be a coin toss. He's also more angry in these comics than I think he ever has been. Usually Shadow's standoffish nature was filled with silence or straight up projection to do his own thing. But if Shadow doesn't like how someone is doing something here, he will let them know it. Which can feel sort of mixed depending on the situation, I will admit, but usually there's a reason for why he's mad at someone. Probably the most justified example of this kind of argument is when Shadow yells at Sonic for convincing him to let Eggman be, when it leads to him getting back into power and releasing a highly contagious metal virus on the world. I mean, I don't think they should kill Eggman either, but you know what, that's fair. The irritation and condescension towards Sonic and his pals doesn't bother me, that makes sense. This recurring thing where Shadow runs into fights to prove he's the strongest opponent to face them, however...
Cowards run. I win.
The first time this happens is during the battle for Angel Island against Neo Metal Sonic, where Shadow doesn't cooperate with the rest of the team and jumps in to confront Metal Sonic head on. Now, if you played Sonic Heroes, you might remember the problem here and why they wanted to use Shadow's power elsewhere, because Neo is able to copy Shadow's data and achieve his final form. There's no excuse here, this was such a dumb move. But the most infamous criticism towards Shadow is in the Zombot storyline, where Shadow is consumed by the metal virus simply because he didn't think he could be overwhelmed and infected. And guess what? He was overwhelmed and infected.
Oh my, what an unexplained tragedy.
A lot of people don't like that Shadow was taken out of the fight at all, but to me, I think it adds a good amount of dramatic tension. I thought Mind Control Shadow was creepy, but Zombot Shadow is especially creepy. That said, I completely agree that there were so many different ways you could have had this happen without having Shadow be a reckless jackass. Heck, you could easily play this into Shadow's well-known martyr complex. Throw himself to the Zombots thinking he'll take longer to infect to save who's left in the city. He could still miscalculate. This is a confusing and terrifying situation that could overwhelm anyone, even the ultimate life form, but it didn't have to make Shadow this arrogant. I like the idea and outcome of his part in the Zombot story in theory. In practice, though, it could have been done way better. But I want to reiterate that I think people were kind of exaggerating in their criticisms toward the Metal Virus arc, aside from the fact that it is way too freaking long. I'm going through this in trade, but if I was reading these issues month to month, I would have been sick of the storyline too. And besides, Shadow does realize his mistake right after everything is fixed, recognizing that as much as he disagrees with Sonic, he had the right idea. Now, granted, that might have been put in there because of the backlash, but I think a character reflecting on or acknowledging their mistakes warrants those mistakes, even really dumb ones, existing in the text. Which leaves us with Shadow's most recent appearance at the time of recording this in the very next storyline, Chow Races and Badnik Bases, where for the most part, Shadow is doing his brooding loner thing again on a mission looking looking for connections to Eggman, dismissing anything that strays from that. However, there are some important moments for him here. There are times where he does show concern for the well-being of others. He's appalled when he finds a bunch of Chow locked up and mistreated, and he briefly considers helping Amy and Rouge on their mission when they cross paths, but quickly talks himself out of it, saying it's not his problem. This all comes to a head in the finale in issue 36, where Shadow races into the fight and charges ahead to face off the bad guy, Dr. Starline, with no regard for an oncoming avalanche that could hurt many innocents or Starline's captives, including Rouge. Rouge intervenes before Shadow can run off after him, though. When Shadow angrily tells Rouge not to tell him what to do, and it feels like we're going to see Shadow do something really stupid again, Rouge says what he does is his choice, and he has to live with the result of those choices. So this time, Shadow does the right thing and helps Sonic stop the avalanche, except what they do doesn't even work. That was kind of a bummer, but still, Sonic is glad he came to help. And you know what? I am too. Yes, Shadow is, in general, more stubborn and cranky than usual in the IDW comics, which can be off-putting. So why does this attitude not bother me as much as it does in, say, Sonic Boom? Well, it's mostly because, as annoying as Shadow's crankiness can be, it's still a deeply motivated attitude. He's not stubborn for no reason, he's still out to protect the world and defeat Eggman, what he's desired to do since he found his true purpose. In fact, you could argue that he's so dedicated to it now that it's narrowed his worldview, unwilling to involve possible allies because he's the ultimate life form. He can handle it just fine. That's an obstacle that could be compelling. Shadow's often tried to face struggles by himself, whether because he thinks he's the best for the job or that it's his duty. Now he has to realize that there's strength in numbers, that even the strongest can accomplish more with a team. He's learned that before. Whether or not Shadow will be allowed to go down that route, though, is yet to be seen. I have no doubt the writers will be able to handle something like this. Ian Flynn wrote some of Shadow's greatest moments in universe, but apparently Sega mandates have a very specific idea of what they want Shadow to be. And reportedly, it makes Shadow very difficult to write for once the notes come back.
The amount of difficulty I have had in getting Shadow to be able to do anything in the book made him something of a liability.
But the conclusion to the Chow Race arc makes me feel like we're getting there. Yes, Shadow's more angry these days, but it's usually connected to his more noble intention to protect the world. He just has to learn that his way isn't the only way, and he can have allies and maybe even friends. Even if it's in small gestures, I think we can inch more towards that in Shadow's future appearances. A good sign to me is this panel where he feeds the Shadow Chow. It's such a small thing, but it was adorable. I like to believe Shadow adopted that Chow secretly, and it's the one from all those promotional pictures. That's my headcanon now. From what I've heard, I know writing for Shadow is frustrating, and I sympathize with those who really try. Seriously, please stop yelling at Ian Flynn and the IDW team about this. Whatever your problems with Shadow are, it's not their fault. Leave them alone. But I am always in favor of keeping Shadow relevant in the franchise. And I think what we're getting right now is a fair compromise between this...
If the world chooses to become my enemy, I will fight like I always have.
And this.
Your shoddy craftsmanship brings shame on all hedgehog kind.
Is it my ideal Shadow? No, my ideal Shadow is in Sonic Universe, but I'd put IDW Shadow right above the main Archie series Shadow and below Sonic Forces Shadow, if you want a ranking. It's almost there. It's pretty good, but with some fine-tuning and possibly the higher-ups lightening up a bit, it could be great. This is an ongoing series. Anything can happen, so we'll just have to see what happens from here. Okay, I think that covers just about everything. That was simple, wasn't it? You know, I'm a little glad this video got pushed back for so long. Back when I put out parts 1 and 2 of the series, the Archie comics had just been cancelled. IDW had announced their run, but hadn't even put out a single issue yet. Sonic Forces hadn't even happened yet. And Shadow hadn't had much of note to do in the franchise for a while. Even if this turned out to be the longest video in the trilogy by a mile, it probably had the most interesting and diverse material to look into. Comics are probably the best place to see how different writers can interpret the same character. With Shadow, it's resulted in taking all sorts of different avenues to approaching his character. This was the most variety I'd ever seen with Shadow. You can argue over which ones are better, but I think they all contribute something meaningful to Shadow's legacy. All of them have potential, both fulfilled and untapped. But something else exciting has happened since I made the first installment of this series back in 2017. Shadow has become much more appreciated for the multi-layered character he is. Don't get me wrong, Shadow has always had fans. There's a reason that out of the surprising amount of Sonic characters who have died, Shadow's the only one so far who got better. But I've seen so many video essays and analysis on the depth of Shadow's character and his contributions to the franchise lately. It's kind of wonderful. The conversation around Shadow has changed a lot in just the last couple of years, especially when it comes to his more recent appearances, which are much more frequent, but they aren't as nuanced as they were in the Adventure era. Sega clearly has a vision for Shadow that some of his fans don't really find appealing. And while I understand that, I don't think the way they've been presenting Shadow lately comes out of left field. He's always been a little grumpy, he's just more so these days because we're at a point where he's sorted out his problems. Like I said, I'm always in favor of keeping Shadow relevant, and he has certainly gotten much more to do since Sonic Forces. I'm particularly fond of those Twitter takeovers, those are great. But I don't think this is always how it's going to be. If looking into Shadow's history proves anything, is that the Sonic franchise is always changing. And now that Shadow is getting more attention in the main series again, and fans are celebrating what makes Shadow so great more vocally lately, with the current and upcoming expanded material to play with, I get the feeling we'll have many different ways to explore the character of Shadow the Hedgehog in the future. Above all else, there is a bright silver lining to end this video on. Shadow the Hedgehog did not make an appearance in the Sonic Boom comic books. I don't have to talk about that horrible version of my favorite Sonic character ever again. Yay! Thanks so much for watching, everyone. It feels so good to get this video out to you all at long last. Definitely let me know what you thought of these comics in the comments below. That's why this series is called Let's Talk About. Special thanks to SpudNinja for providing the voice for Shadow the Hedgehog, and Sebastian Canino for playing Sonic the Hedgehog. Links to both their channels are in the description, so go show them some love. And thanks as always to my patrons who help support my content, including Dave L. Sproul, Sebastian Canino of Cinemageddon Reviews, Chelsea Crandall, Hawk Hero, Crowless, and Jinx Productions. If you'd like to join these fine people in supporting my content while getting cool exclusive perks, you can check out my Patreon page at the link in the description, as well as my other social media if you'd like to follow me on any of those. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.